Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we're going to be covering the other class that came out in the Impossible playtest, the Runesmith. The Runesmith is really interesting, and it's going to offer some really cool buffing and even debuffing kind of potential. So if you're someone who likes a buffing class who is going to be really good at buffing their teammates, definitely check out the Runesmith. And as I kind of said before in the last video as well, the playtests, the URL to the playtest and the surveys are going to be included in the description of this video. So please go check them out, and please give your feedback to Paizo, even if it's just your thoughts, because if anything, we want these classes to be really good. And so if there's anything about these that you kind of don't like, heck, the worst thing that can happen is they just ignore your advice. But oftentimes, Paizo just makes these classes really, really good. And that only happens because they are players themselves, and they also listen to the players who play their game. So, you know, I'm sure everyone has at least something to offer when it comes to their input on these classes, and it would mean a lot to the game if you gave even just a little bit. But let's talk about the Runesmith. So, another intelligence-based class. This is interesting, to say the least. The Necromancer, I can kind of see, but knowing that the Runesmith is an intelligence-based class, it definitely... There's some reasons for this, obviously. So intelligence is one of the least offensive kind of attributes a character can have, because it's not tied to any core stats used in combat, really. Now, of course, you can use it for like recall knowledge, but technically you can use wisdom for recall knowledge. So it's not necessarily an impotent stat, and in fact, it gives you a lot of skill proficiencies, at least early in the game. But if it was wisdom, for instance, then the character would have better will saves. And it could be charisma, and I could definitely see that being a more artistic. And maybe, you know, they could change it to charisma. I think that would be really cool, especially because we really don't have a lot of marshals that are charisma based, which I think is really, really a big missing point. So who knows if this will stay intelligence or not. And the same could be said for Necromancer. But honestly, I'd give my vote for moving it to charisma instead. I think that would be more art-based and more like performance is even a skill they can use through one of their feats for how they use their runes, which is very interesting. So we have an intelligence, and it's an 8+ constitution modifier, really common for any class that has, you know, not completely martial capabilities and offers some extra benefit like buffing or the like. So very standard. Also, we have expert in both fortitude and will, not great at reflex. This class has been very much portrayed as being like a more heavier armor wearing character, even though they only get up to medium armor proficiency. And also we have trained in martial weapons, and the skill proficiencies are interesting because you get crafting, your choice of arcana, nature, occultism, or religion, which I think you're going to want all of these for reasons I'll talk about here in a bit. So you're definitely going to want to invest into probably more than one of those, and then 2 plus your intelligence modifier. Maybe that was the reason why they decided to make this an intelligence-based class, because legitimately this class just has a lot of requirements as far as like at least trained proficiencies in certain skills, though they don't even roll those skills, which is also really interesting. I don't know. It's a very interesting class, to say the least. But let's go ahead and take a look at the main aspects. So here they talk about runes, invocations, and the diacritic. Diacritic is specific for a rune that affects a rune. So a rune modification, a very interesting system, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the rest of this, the only thing you really need to know is you have easy methods of etching or tracing a rune onto an object, and then you can invoke that rune, speaking its true name and creating an extra effect, though this causes the rune to immediately disappear. So the buffs we're giving in this game are going to give some decent benefits, and then can be invoked for much greater benefits, though the rune will then fade away. A very interesting concept, and it definitely creates an interesting style of play. So the main thing that you really need to know is the trace rune, which is a 1 or 2 action ability, and invoke rune. So trace rune is 1 action if the target is adjacent, or 2 actions if they are within 30 feet, or this is an exploration activity that you can do to etch a rune onto a piece of armor, though doing so takes about 10 minutes, and technically that's not a part of trace rune, but it's just the other way. So in 10 minutes, either at the beginning of the day or during your travel, you can etch runes onto armor. The major difference is runes that are traced on only last until the end of your next turn. So obviously etching runes is better if you want an effect that is going to last longer, while tracing runes is more beneficial for like an immediate invoke or for a debuff on an enemy, since obviously they're not going to let you etch it onto them beforehand. So we also have invoke rune, and this is a singular action that can invoke any rune within 30 feet and applies its invoke effect on the target. And then once you're done, the rune fades away or disappears. So this is our main mechanics. Now that sounds really, really action heavy, but many of the feats related to the Runesmith are all about action economy and applying runes even better. Also, we have a Runesmith Runic repertoire, because this is kind of like a caster class. They get caster-like abilities, even the ability late game to inscribe a rune that gives a 4th level or 4th rank or lower spell effect to a target. So there's a lot of very interesting things with the class, but all you need to know is that you have a certain number of runes that you know, and then you have a certain amount of maximum runes you can have etched at any one time. Now, etched runes means that this does not include traced runes. So feel free to etch up and give your team all the great benefits that you can, because the tracing runes onto enemies is not going to go past that limit. There's also this very interesting kind of like pseudo mechanic with runic magic. This section right here really talks about the fact that some runes will have like a tradition, like arcane, primal, whatever, attached to it. And if it doesn't have one, then you can give it one, and you might even need to for some effects, if you are at least trained in the required skill, which is why I mentioned that you're going to kind of want like all of them, because there's some rune effects for mixing different types of runes together to create an even more powerful effect. So very interesting, though I feel like there's a lot of missed potential here. I love the idea that runes of different traditions have very different styles, where arcane is more of that traditional like runic style that we're all very familiar with, while primal could look more like etched or natural, while celestial can be, or celestial, divine can be like celestial, very alien but very holy, while occult can be something that's more sinister and overly complicated. Like there was some really great potential for some cool subclasses for this class that I feel like we kind of missed out on. I don't know what more it would do, and this class already fills up quite a few pages anyway, but I like the idea and the imagery behind it, and I think that just would have been really, really cool to capitalize on. Runic magic mostly just talks about traditions on the stuff, as well as your magic. Your runes are not spells, but they are magical, and so can be affected by things that can affect magic. It's a little bit complicated, and I'm not going to go over it all here, but you can read it in the playtest yourself. Also, shield block. I love this feat. It's really, really good. Glad to see a class that starts with it. Again, really makes this want to be a armored up and near the front line kind of character, because a lot of your benefits are really focused on targets within a somewhat close range, though I would be interested to see more features for a more light or even unarmored style of Runesmith, who is more magical in nature. I think that would also be really, really cool. Also, another really cool feature here, we have a rune crafter. So essentially, at second level, you automatically gain the magical crafting skill feat, and you automatically gain the formulas for pretty much all the fundamental runes for armor and weapons and shields. Though, I guess not all, but most, obviously. The base ones, armor or potency, resilient, striking, and weapon potency. And as you level up, you get the higher versions as you do so. So you're really good at crafting runes, and that's actually another part of the class that you can really dive into with their feats. Oh, I'm sorry, not their feats. They get a feature at 9th level called Assured Runic Crafting, which whenever you roll a check to craft a magic item that is a rune specifically, you automatically will get 1 degree of success better than the result of your crafting check, oftentimes allowing you to make the runes much quicker than you normally would be able to. So Assured Runic Crafting is really cool and something I really wish we got again with like Alchemist for alchemical items, but I guess there's just way more alchemical items than there are runes. So I guess this is just a much more reduced scope, but I feel like this makes sense for at least something like the Alchemist, not necessarily Inventor, even though there are like invention items, but at least with Alchemist, it would make a lot of sense as well. Other than that, another really cool thing as well is Runic Optimization. This essentially takes the weapon specialization for the class, but it's better. So weapon specialization traditionally always gives you a bonus bit of extra damage when you're making your strikes, and it is a bonus based on how proficient you're striking the enemy. Doing more and more, the higher your proficiency up to legendary. Now, most classes don't get legendary besides the fighter and the gunslinger, but the runic optimization here kind of ignores the proficiency and only requires that your weapon is equipped with a specific rune, predominantly the striking runes. So you get a benefit with a striking rune, greater striking rune, or major striking rune, rather than being expert, master, or legendary proficiency, though you do get less of a bonus than you would get with weapon specialization. And I will even say when you get the greater weapon specialization, your major striking rune benefit with a 6 is about the same as most other martials would get with just getting master proficiency. So while the Runesmith is definitely not getting a step above other martials because they could get to the end of their essentially weapon specialization easier, they are only limited by the fact of when they receive the rune. And runes can only be crafted by players up to their level, but that's not saying they can't just order someone, buy a weapon with a better rune or even find one. Meaning that the Runesmith, funny enough, has one of the better optimizations when it comes to the specialization if they can pay to win, which is really, really funny. It's really cool. It's very interesting. And the thing about the rune optimizations, you're always going to be using predominantly weapons that have a rune of some kind on it. So that's just how the game is balanced. So you're always going to get these benefits. The same thing for other martials who are just using their specializations with, proficiency. But still, I think this is it's cool. It's interesting. I really like it. And it definitely also really motivates you to get your weapons modified as quickly as possible, really pushing the crafter aspect for this particular class. Now, on the playtest, I also wanted to point out just a little bit of an error. So the expert runes here says it increases your proficiency to master DC, but it's actually supposed to be expert. In fact, right across the way, we have master runes that gives you more appropriately. So just a little bit of an error here with the runes, and as well, this is another class that gets legendary class proficiency, which is really cool. Legendary proficiency is very rare. Well, I guess becoming less and less rare as the new classes come out, but it offers a class that is really good with a lot of archetypes in the game because you get a lot of benefits that usually scale based on your class DC. So The Runesmith getting legendary proficiency makes them really good with those kind of archetypes, allowing this class to be very flexible with how you design it. And speaking on design, let's go ahead and talk about some of their feats. So I do kind of have a problem with backup runic enchantment here, or enhancement. So this feat gives you the sigil cantrip, and once per day you can cast either runic body or a runic weapon as an innate spell. And your rank for these spells automatically heightens to half your level rounded up. So you get essentially a free heightening spell. But these are some of the worst spells in the game. The action economy and just the fact that the game's general scaling is supposed to include striking runes in it means you almost never need to use these because your team typically always has them. And if you're just going to be swapping to another weapon you have on hand for some reason or another, then yeah, sure, it's kind of nice, but you have to spend 2 actions to buff a weapon to then use. And I feel like you could just make this unlimited casts. I don't feel like there's any need not to, because they last only a minute, so you can only use them in combat. And it's not like your whole team can really benefit from it. Maybe one of your teammates doesn't have to spend some money if you're willing to spend your actions on them. But I feel like if it was unlimited, that would make this a lot more interesting, because rather than making a choice once per day, you always can just be like, oh, okay, picks up a dagger or like a fork even, whispers some runes onto it and throw it, and it does a lot more damage. Like, that's really cool. But the fact that you only get that once per day, like, yeah, sure, it's a level 1 feat. I get that, but the spells I don't feel are so powerful that making them unlimited would actually change all that more and would actually allow players to do more interesting things with them. Because as it stands right now, the sigil cantrip isn't worth the feat pickup, and that's the only reason why I would even consider it, just because runic body and runic weapon are so non-essential for most of the game. Though, another feat that's really good, actually, one I actually really, really like, is Engraving Strike. Once per round, as an action, you can strike an enemy and then trace a rune onto them if that strike was a success. That's really good, and this is kind of one of the major parts of the Runesmith, where a lot of their feats kind of become necessary because they clean up an otherwise very messy action economy for the class. So Engraving Strike, I think, is really, really good, and it's something that I feel will make the class kind of work better. In fact, I feel like Engraving Strike is so good, it should almost become a part of the class. Now, I don't necessarily think it needs to, but it's very much in contention for like a must-take feat. Though, we also have Rune Singer here, which is really interesting. So, Rune Singer allows you to use performance instead of crafting whenever you're making crafting checks related to runes, which is why I mentioned charisma would be really interesting for the Runesmith. And more specifically, once per minute, you can trace a rune with a singular action on a target that is at the 2 action range. So this allows you to apply a rune without necessarily being adjacent for less actions. This one's also really good and allows for a much less upfront and personal kind of playstyle, which I really like. This is really good because I feel like this creates different playstyle choices. And even for Engraving Strike, this cleans up action economy, allowing you to participate in martial combat without necessarily giving up a lot of your power. The backup runic enhancement, compared to those others too, this just feels like a worse feat in almost every regard. And I'm sure for the more eagle-eyed viewers out there, Runic Tattoo has been kind of sticking out to you. Yeah, you get to just inscribe one of your runes onto your body, and that rune is always etched on you, and it doesn't count towards your maximum number of etched runes, meaning you can just always give yourself a buff. That's really good. Now, you can change your tattoo, but it takes a week of downtime. That sounds awful. That's worse than normal tattoo removal, But, you know, it's still pretty cool. In fact, that you can just give yourself a very consistent buff makes the Runesmith, honestly. So I don't like dual class games. I feel like dual class it breaks a lot of what makes Pathfinder. And you can agree or disagree. It really doesn't matter. But in favor of dual classing, Runesmith looks like a really, really good for pretty much any martial, because you can just enhance yourself with all these really, really good buffs that you can then just activate if you want to for a singular action. And it just, like Runic Tattoo especially, just adds on to an extra rune you could technically etch onto yourself. A fighter Runesmith is terrifying because they're just a fighter with none of the weaknesses of a fighter. It's really, really good. So yeah, Runesmith is definitely going to be interesting if you decide to partake in dual class style games. Not one I like particularly, but for those who do, there's going to be a lot of fun theory crafting, I'm sure. Like the last video, I'm not going to go over every single feat that comes up on here. I'm just going to mention a couple that really stuck out to me. Drawn in Red is also really, really good. So Drawn in Red is a free action if your last action was a successful melee strike that dealt physical damage, which can be our engraving strike. And what happens is after you strike the target, you run your brush or finger along with the blood that you collected on it. And now for the remainder of that combat, you can now trace runes on that target at a range of 60 feet with a singular action. And if you use this on anyone else, you can just wipe off that blood as a free action and then use it on someone else. So this allows you to strike an enemy who is fleeing and then give yourself an enhanced range to infect them, or a lot of really interesting things. That's really cool, and that really adds a level of interesting things. Like runes are very adaptable. You can use runes in a lot of ways, whether it's like with ink brush or etched in with a chisel or something like that. There's a lot of really cool ways and a lot of cool imagery that I feel like this class really offers. But nothing more gives that imagery than one of their feats. Which feat was that? Define the canvas. This one is absolutely insane. So this one's 2 actions, and you can only use it once per 10 minutes, essentially once per combat kind of ability. And you create a 20-foot burst canvas on a bunch of squares on the ground, essentially. And while you are within the canvas, you can trace a rune directly into the ground, which causes the rune to expand across the entire surface, tracing that on however many creatures on that canvas that you want. And the canvas lasts for a minute. That's really cool. It gives a very like painter kind of artist vibe, you know, like you see the Japanese art style where a canvas rolls out and then the brush strokes and everything like that. That's really powerful. A 20-foot burst is actually a pretty massive range. And being able to use a rune on all enemies, that's so worth the action economy. The enemies are going to flee, but then they just won't enter that zone and you just have complete dominance over it. That's really, really cool. Now, that is a level 14 feat, but that's really awesome. But we definitely can't finish off this video without talking about the runes themselves. So I love how they worked with the runes, because each of these runes are essentially recipes that you can know. You get to learn up to 13, but there are 2 feats that give you up to 3 more, which is really good. And they're definitely going to be adding more when the class actually releases. So everything you see here is not even necessarily the full limit. There's probably going to be a lot, and that's really cool. But what I really like about the runes is the runes all have like a name, and names are very specific for runic kind of languages. They have a lot of meaning and power. So for instance, like the rune of fire is named Atiro, or the rune of whetstones is called Esvadir. That's very cool. That's very thematic and very flavorful. But the thing I like about it the most is those what was it? It's some weird word. Diacritic. There we go. Diacritic runes, which are rune enhancements that you enhance other runes with, that add oftentimes a prefix onto it. So the rune of expansion, for instance, adds N. So applying Rune of Expansion to the Rune of Fire would make N Atrial or N Esvidir. That's really cool. I love the idea of actually making like a grammatic syntax for the runes. It makes it feel more real, like you're actually interacting with something from the setting, which I think is very, very cool. The runes are also pretty solid. Rune of Fire is probably one of the most basic ones, and it doesn't really do anything super crazy. It reduces a target's fire resistance by 6 at base, and then these heighten because these are kind of like spells. So they heighten, and the level is your level, not spell rank. So this heightens every 2 levels or every odd level essentially after 1. So 1, 3, 5, 7, those. Now, when you invoke Ethereal, the target takes 2d6 fire damage with a basic fortitude saving throw, and on a crit fail, they are dazzled. That's pretty good. And when it heightens, it increases by an additional 2d6, and the target loses 1 resistance. And for the invocation, they actually have the reduced resistance because the rune doesn't fade until after the invocation. So you can use the Rune of Fire to hurt fire-like beings as long as they're not immune to fire, which is really cool. Now, a favorite of a lot of people, probably in the early game, is going to be Esvidir. This one, etched onto a piercing or slashing weapon, allows on a successful strike to deal an additional persistent bleed damage per weapon damage die, which is absolutely huge. And when you invoke it, the rune does 2d6 slashing damage to a creature adjacent to the rune bearer. Rune bearer is whoever's bearing the rune. Figured I'd make mention of that. With a basic fortitude saving throw. And there are ways you can actually like bounce a rune where you invoke it and then reapply it onto the rune that you're invoking through the feats. So you actually have some really good ways of working in tandem with a teammate, buffing their gear and then invoking on them while bouncing the rune, allowing you to do some really interesting things. And you can very easily invoke this rune or trace this rune onto an ally within, 30 feet for 2 actions, and then invoke it for 1 action, allowing you to essentially apply your spells, and they're infinite. Now, their damage is not necessarily absolutely insane, and that's 3 actions to do essentially what is a 2-action spell. But with all the different ways that you can mess with the action economy and the many, many interesting types of feats and runes, this is a class that's going to make supporting your team really fun. And I'm sure the multi-class is going to be very, very sought after because it's going to give you some really cool buffs. Actually, speaking of really cool buffs, let's end this off with some of their more late game. The level 9 ones are crazy. So the first one I want to talk about, is Dros, the Rune of Dragon Fury. This one is etched onto armor, and it's absolutely insane. So whenever a creature strikes the rune bearer or steals something from them, they become off guard for 1 round. That's terrifying. Put that on a fighter, put it on a barbarian, and the enemy has a choice to make. Attack the target who's trying to kill them, the only way they can really win the encounter, and be off guard and be very critical for pretty much the entire combat. That's horrifying. This is also really good to put on an ally you don't want the enemies to attack because, they can make themselves very vulnerable. Especially if the enemy doesn't know how to read runes, they don't even know what's going to happen until they strike the enemy and realize, oh, I have made a big mistake. The invocation is also really cool because as a free action, you can cause the rune bearer to fly up to 60 feet towards a creature that has damaged them in the last minutes. So it doesn't even have to be the last one. It's just anyone who's pretty much hit them in the fight. If they end their movement adjacent to the creature, that creature becomes off guard until the rune bearer's at the end of the rune bearer's next turn. Now, if the rune bearer doesn't have a fly speed and ends its movement in the air, they safely float back to the ground. That's just to kind of help with, some unfortunate circumstances, but that's really good, and that's terrifying. Archers shooting your teammates, and then the barbarian flies up to them, and then they pee themselves because they're about to die a horrible death. And they're also off guard, so yeah, doubly so. That's really, really cool. Another one I really like is the elf gate, IUN. So IUN is very interesting because just as a part of having this etched onto a creature, they get to, once per turn, whenever they would take a stride action, they just teleport to the distance of their speed instead. That's really cool, and something I'm sure many, many people are going to want for their endgame characters to make them even more badass. But even more interesting than that is the invocation. So you can teleport the rune bearer to a location adjacent to any of your other runes as long as they're on the same plane. An unwilling target can attempt a will save to resist this teleportation. Imagine you're etched. This is your tattoo. You're always etched with this. Anytime you can invoke it. And when, by the way, when it's tattooed onto you, I didn't mention this, but if you do invoke it, it fades and then you can't use it until your next daily preparations. So you can't do this infinitely. But when you tattoo this on yourself, you can teleport to any rune you put onto someone. You kind of get this near omnipotentness that you get with just that ability, which is really cool. And it has a special feature where if you have the ability to cast the sigil cantrip, which I did mention that feat that does have it earlier, then you can use your invocation to teleport to that location instead. And that one doesn't have as bad of a time limit. So there are really cool runes, and there are some very smart and intelligent ways you can play this class. I like it. I think it's very interesting, and it adds another interesting crafting character to the list of classes in the game. I really do like classes that offer more than just combat benefits because it gives them more role playability, more potential. A runesmith, even just what we were talking about earlier with the traditions and like how your runes are designed, it's something that is, oh, I should mention that as well. Can really flavor your character and make your characters way more interesting than classes that really don't offer that kind of benefit. And I did mention before the compositions. So there are a variety of feats where, let's see, there's a really good one that is, here we go. So we have vital composite invocation. So this one allows you to invoke 2 runes of your choice on a single creature. One must be divine and the other must be primal. In addition to the rune's normal effects, the creature also regains hit points equal to your intelligence modifier plus double your level. So to invoke 2 runes, that would normally be 2 actions anyway, so you can decide once per 10 minutes to just do them both at the same time and give your ally a pretty good amount of healing to intelligence plus double your level in HP. That's pretty substantial. That's a really good healing effect, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more like this. Also, there's a very interesting thing I learned just with this class about kind of the lore of Galarian. So, clashing composite invocation, another one that you can use only once per 10 minutes, makes you use 2 runes of opposing natures on a singular target, and when you do, they become sickened as there's like an imbalance created by the harmonic clash. And so I learned through this that oppositions of the traditions is arcane to divine and occult to primal. That feels so backwards to me in many ways. I figured arcane and primal would be oppositions as well as divine and occult. I mean, arcane is the harnessing and like the culture of magic. Wizards are the primary arcane class in the game, and they are, they're the ones who've mastered and learned magic, while primal is something that's more natural. Like the druid doesn't learn their spells in a book. They just use the powers of the elements. So it's completely in opposition of theme. Same thing with divine and occult. The divine is of like a religious and otherworldly kind of presence in a way that is more, like divine, as the name would imply. Well, occult is more outside of that. Powers and benefits that don't come from gods, but something other, something alien. And I don't know if I agree with how clashing composite here works. I feel like they should be swapped around. I feel like if we just swapped primal and divine, there you go. But yeah, I guess in Galarian lore, at least as far as this feat isn't telling us, arcane and divine are opposed and occult and primal are opposed. So yeah, the more you know. To end it all here, the Runesmith is a very interesting class. And while I'm definitely not as excited for the Runesmith as I am for the Necromancer, I do gotta say that this class does look like it's a lot of fun. Just the big brain plays you can make with how you make all your runes and all the flavor that's kind of just mixed in that isn't in your face. It's not so protagonisty as much as just like a fun hobby. You know, you're not like a sorcerer whose bloodline is like, oh, I came from dragons, so I'm pretty cool, huh? The Runesmith is like, I really like words, and I like writing words on things, you know? Even just like the idea of that, you know? Maybe your Runesmith is a graffiti artist, and you do all those fun names, but in graffiti style. Like, I think there's some really, really cool thoughts and ideas that can come from this class particularly, so definitely one I'm keeping an eye on, and that is it for the playtest coverage. Let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments below, and as well, leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe for more, as I'll be covering more stuff as Paizo releases. Next year, we have a big year with Battle Cry releasing, Starfinder 2nd Edition, and now whatever this Impossible book is going to be. A lot of people have been saying it's based on the Impossible lands, and while I definitely think that may be true, being, you know, a very magic-y class and a very like undead magic-y class makes a lot of sense. I just don't know what the book is actually going to be like about, because we already got an Impossible Lands book. What are we getting more information on the Impossible Lands? Because that feels more excessive than they've done with literally anything else. So yeah, I don't know. I'm very intrigued to find out, but unfortunately we won't until sometime next year. So if you want to find that information out at the same time I do, I recommend to subscribe. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.